Hello friends, today we are going to talk about cervical vertebra. There are 7 cervical vertebrae in our body. 3 of them are atypical and 4 of them is typical. The atypical cervical vertebrae are the first cervical vertebra, second cervical vertebra and the seventh cervical vertebra. The first cervical vertebra is called atlas, the second cervical vertebra is called axis, and the seventh cervical vertebra is called the vertebra prominens. And the third to sixth cervical vertebra are the typical cervical vertebra. Now we need to know how to identify a cervical vertebra. The characteristic feature of a cervical vertebra is the presence of foramen transversarium in the transverse process. This is the foramen transversarium. This foramen transversarium is only present in the cervical vertebrae. Now, in case of the thoracic vertebra, their body is heart-shaped, and they have a long and their spinous process is directed downwards and backwards, and their vertebral foramen is usually round and small. Now, in case of lumbar vertebra, their body is massive and kidney shaped, and their vertebral foramen is large and triangular, and their spinous process is short and stout. And in the transverse process, there are usually 2 processes are present. They are accessory process and mammillary process. So this is how you can identify a cervical vertebra. Now we are going to discuss how to identify a typical cervical vertebra. A typical cervical vertebra has these features. They have a very small body, vertebral body, and their spinous process is short and bifid, and their transverse process usually present with a foramen transversarium, and they have anterior posterior roots, anterior posterior tubercle, and a costotransverse bar. So by these typical features you can identify a typical cervical vertebra. The third to sixth typical cervical vertebra are the typical cervical vertebra. Now we are going to discuss about the parts of a typical cervical vertebra. First we come to the body. This is the body of a typical cervical vertebra. It is small and transversely oval, and the upper surface of the body presents 2 uncal processes. These 2 are the uncal processes of a typical cervical vertebra, and these uncal processes articulate with the body of the previous cervical vertebra to form the uncovertebral joints, and the body of the cervical vertebra articulates with the body of the surrounding body of the adjacent cervical vertebra to form a secondary cartilaginous joint with the intervertebral discs. Now we come to the transverse process. This is the transverse process. The transverse process has costal elements and transverse elements. It has 5 parts: an anterior root, a posterior root, anterior tubercle, a posterior tubercle, and a costotransverse bar. This is the costotransverse bar. Now the anterior root, the anterior tubercle, and the costotransverse bar represent the costal elements of the transverse process, and the posterior root and the posterior tubercle makes the true transverse element. And the transverse process bears a foramen transversarium in the center. The foramen transversarium lodges second part of vertebral artery and vertebral veins and the plexus of nerves surrounding the vertebral artery. And the costotransverse bar lodges the anterior rami, ventral rami of the corresponding cervical nerve. Now we come to the muscle attachment of the cervical vertebra. The anterior tubercle gives attached to 3 sets of muscles: longus colli, longus capitis, and scalenus anterior. And the posterior tubercle provides attachment to the scalenus medius, scalenus posterior, and levator scapulae. Now I come to the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is large and triangular to accommodate the cervical enlargement of the spinal cord, and its boundary is made by the 2 pedicles and 2 laminas. The pedicles are small and they are directed backwards and laterally, and they arise from the posterolateral aspect of the body, and they arise at the middle point of the upper and lower margins of the vertebral body. So the superior and inferior vertebral notches are equally conspicuous. If you see closely, you can see that this is the superior vertebral notch, and this is the inferior vertebral notch. These two vertebral notches are equally conspicuous. Now we come to the pedicule. The pedicles arise from the pedicles are directed medially and backwards, and they unite to form the spinous process. Now we come to the spinous process. The spinous process are short and bifid, and the tip of the spinous process gives attachment to the ligamentum nuchae and some deep muscles of the back. Now we come to the superior and inferior articular processes. This is the superior articular process, and this is the inferior articular process. The superior articular process is directed backwards and upwards, and the inferior articular process is directed reciprocally downwards and forwards. They articulate with the corresponding cervical vertebrae to form plain type of cervical joints. And they form a continuous articular pillar. So the superior articular facet and the inferior articular facet, these two and this mass of bone is called the articular pillar. This articular pillar in this lateral aspect contains a curved groove. This is for the lodgement of the dorsal rami of the corresponding cervical nerve. Now we come to the relations between the cervical nerves and the cervical vertebra. We know that there are 8 cervical nerves, and there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. So all the cervical nerves lies above the corresponding cervical vertebra. So the first cervical vertebra, above the first cervical vertebra, there is the first cervical nerve. Above the second cervical vertebra, there lies the second cervical nerve. Only the 8th cervical nerve passes below the 7th cervical vertebra. So this is the relation between the cervical nerves and the cervical vertebra. Now we come to the atlas. This is the atlas, or the first cervical vertebra. This is an atypical cervical vertebra because it has no body, no spinous process, and there is no lateral mass. The superior and inferior articular processes are, you can see, very large and conspicuous. Now the atlas, it is a atypical cervical vertebra, and it has 3 parts, mainly 3 parts, and a short anterior arch, a long posterior arch, and a lateral mass. It also has a transverse process. Now the anterior arch is small, and it has an anterior tubercle in front and a articular facet behind. This is the articular facet, and you can see that the first cervical vertebra has no body, because the body of the first cervical vertebra fuses with the body of the second cervical vertebra to form the odontoid process or dens of the second cervical vertebra or the axis. So you can see the atlas rotates around its own body. And now we come to the posterior arch. The posterior arch is longer than the anterior arch, and it presents a posterior tubercle, and just behind the lateral mass you can see a large groove, and in anterior part of the posterior arch it is present here for the lodgement of third part of vertebral artery and the corresponding cervical nerve. The nerve lies between the third part of vertebral artery and the bone. Now I come to the lateral mass. This is the lateral mass of the bone, and it has a superior articular process, a inferior articular process, and this is a tubercle of the lateral mass. The superior articular process is large and kidney shaped, and it is directed upwards and medially, and the inferior articular process is round and flat, and it is directed downwards and medially. Now I come to the transverse process. The transverse process is unusually long and it has no anterior root, anterior tubercle. This part represents the costotransverse bar of a typical cervical vertebra, and this is the posterior root, and the tip of the transverse process represents the posterior root, posterior tubercle of a typical cervical vertebra, and this is the foramen transversarium. And this tip of the atlas has many important relations. The transverse process of the atlas is related anteriorly with the internal jugular vein. It is crossed by the tip by the spinal part of accessory nerve and occipital artery. And the tip of the transverse process of the atlas is overlapped by the parotid glands. Now I come to the attachments of the atlas. The anterior tubercle gives attachment to the anterior longitudinal ligament. The superior border of the anterior arch gives attachment to the anterior Atlanto-Occipital membrane, and the lower margin of the anterior arch gives attachment to the Atlanto-Axial membrane. Now we come to the attachment of the posterior arch. The posterior tubercle gives attachment to the ligamentum nuchae. The superior margin of the posterior arch gives attachment to the posterior Atlanto-Occipital membrane, and the lower margin of the posterior arch gives attachment to the ligamentum flava, the highest pair of ligamentum flava. And the lateral mass is weight bearing, and the superior articular surface articulates with the occipital condyle of the occipital bone to form the elliptical Atlanto-Occipital joint, and the inferior articular facet, it articulates with the superior articular process of the second cervical vertebra. Now we come to the attachment of the transverse process. The transverse process gives attachment to the rectus capitis lateralis, superior obliquus on its upper surface, inferior obliquus at its tip, and slip of Spinous cervicis, levator scapulae, and splenius medius on its lower and lateral surface. Now we come to the second cervical vertebra, or the axis. And this is called axis because the odontoid process or dens acts as a pivot for the atlas. So this is called the axis, and it has three typical features. First of all, its odontoid process or dens and its large weight bearing superior articular facets and a massive and bifid spine. Now we come to the odontoid process. This is the odontoid process of the second cervical vertebra or the axis. This odontoid process is formed by the body of the first cervical vertebra. At its tip, it gives attachment to the apical ligament. The apical ligament is a remnant of the notochord, and the two lateral edges of the odontoid process gives attachment to the alar ligament. And we can see at the posterior part, it has a concave groove. It is for accompanying the transverse ligament of the lateral mass of the first cervical vertebra. Now we come to the lateral mass. In the lateral mass, there is its characteristic feature, which is the large weight bearing superior articular facets. It usually overhangs the foramen transversarium. So you can see this is the foramen transversarium, and the superior articular facets overhang the foramen transversarium. And this is the spinous process of the axis. This spinous process gives attachment to the ligamentum nuchae and a few muscles. The muscles are rectus capitis posterior major, obliquus capitis inferior, and semispinalis cervicalis, multifidus, and rotators. and the transverse process is very small, and it presents a foramen transversarium. Now we are going to talk about the weight transmission to the cervical vertebra. From the head, the weight is transmitted through the occipital condyles of the occipital bone to the lateral mass of the first cervical vertebra, and from the inferior articular facets of the first cervical vertebra, it is transmitted through the superior articular facets of the second cervical vertebra, and from then and its lower part, the weight is transmitted through the body of the cervical vertebras. Now I come to the seventh cervical vertebra. This is the seventh cervical vertebra. It is also called vertebra prominens, and it has the characteristic features of a large unbifid spine, and the transverse processes may or may not bear foramen transversarium, and sometimes the foramen transversarium can be duplicate or double. The transverse process is usually large, and costal element is small. The anterior tubercle is often absent. You can see that there is no anterior tubercle in case of here, and the foramen transversarium is small and sometimes may be duplicated. The foramen transmits only in the plexus of vertebral veins, but not the vertebral artery, because the second part of vertebral artery passes above the seventh cervical vertebra. The tip of the lower surface of the transverse process gives attachment to the supraplural membrane or Simpson's fascia. Sometimes the seventh cervical vertebra may give rise to a cervical rib, which may arise from the costal element of the seventh cervical vertebra. Now we come to the joints of the cervical vertebrae and the skull. Now first we are going to talk about the Atlanto-Occipital Joint. It is the ellipsoid variety of synovial joint, and it is formed by the superior articular facets of the atlas and the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. This is the occipital condyle, and this is the superior articular facet of the atlas, and they form the ellipsoid Atlanto-Occipital Joint. So this is the Atlanto-Occipital Joint. It is the ellipsoid variety of synovial joint, and the movements that are produced here are flexion, extension, and lateral flexion. This is a lateral flexion, and this Atlanto-Occipital Joint is innervated by the first cervical nerve. Now I come to the Atlanto-Axial Joint. This is the axis and this is the atlas, and this is the axial joint. There are three Atlanto-Axial joints. One median Atlanto-Axial joint, which is made. This is the medial Atlanto-Axial joint. It is formed by the Odontoid process of the axis and the facet which is present on the anterior arch of the atlas. They are attached in this manner to form the median Atlanto-Axial joint, which is a pivot variety of synovial joint. The Odontoid process makes the pivot, and the ring is formed by the anterior arch, and we described about these tubercles on the lateral mass of the first cervical vertebra. They lodge a transverse ligament. This transverse ligament makes the ring complete. So the joint is going to be made by this anterior arch and this transverse ligament, and the movements that are produced here are rotatory movements. We can also call it no movement. So when we say no, the way we nod our head, this movement is produced in the median Atlanto-Axial joint. And there are also two lateral Atlanto-Axial joints. This is formed by the superior articular facet of the lateral mass of the axis and the inferior articular facet of the lateral mass of the atlas, and they form the lateral Atlanto-Axial joints. So this is the lateral Atlanto-Occipital joint, and they are plain type of synovial joint, and they allow sliding movements, and they mainly help in the rotatory movements of the median Atlanto-Occipital joint. And this median and lateral Atlanto-Occipital joints are innervated by the second cervical nerve. Now we come to the joints between the typical cervical vertebrae. So these two are the typical cervical vertebra, and they are attached in this way. The bodies are attached with each other by secondary cartilaginous joint with the intervertebral discs, and the unclasped process is attached to the body by a synovial uncovertebral joint, and the superior articular facet of a cervical vertebra is attached to the inferior articular facet of the vertebra which lies above and makes plain type of synovial joint. And the inferior articular facet attached with the superior articular facet of the lower cervical vertebra. And there is a membranous joint made by the ligamentum flava which connects the lamina. So these are the joints of the cervical vertebrae. Now we are going to talk about some ligaments which directly connect the axis with the occipital bone. These ligaments are apical ligament, alar ligament, cruciate ligament, or cruciform ligament, and membrana tectoria. The apical ligament arises from the tip of the odontoid process, which is a remnant of the notochord, and it connects the tip of the axis with the basilar part of the occipital bone, just in front of the anterior margin of the foramen magnum. And there is two alar ligaments. The alar ligaments arise from the slope at the lateral aspect of the odontoid process, and they go towards the opposite directions, and they are attached with a small tubercle at the condylar part of the occipital bone. So you can see, if you see closely, you can see that there are two tubercles present on the condylar part. This tubercle gives attachment to the alar ligament. Now I come to the cruciform ligament. It has two parts, a vertical band and a horizontal band. The horizontal band is very prominent, and it corresponds with the transverse ligament which we explained earlier. The transverse ligament is attached in this median tubercle of the lateral mass of the first cervical vertebra. This represents the transverse part of the transverse or horizontal part of the cruciform ligament. Now I come to the longitudinal band of the cruciate ligament. It goes in both upwards and downwards direction, and the upper band of the cruciate ligament gives attachment to the basilar part of the occipital bone, in between the membrana tectoria and apical ligament. And the lower band of cruciate ligament is attached to the body of the lower part of the second cervical vertebra. Now we come to the membrana tectoria. Membrana tectoria, it is the continuation of the posterior longitudinal ligament, and it covers the body of the odontoid process and all the ligaments, and it is attached to the basilar part of the occipital bone. So this is all about the cervical vertebrae. If you have any query, you can contact us in our Facebook page or comment in the comment box below, and please like and subscribe to our channel.